Hello everyone and welcome on back to the channel. We have some good balance patch notes to get into. So in this video, I'm going to be going over some of the balance changes that I find to be the most interesting. There is quite a lot with this balance patch. My overall impressions for everything are overwhelmingly positive. I think that this balance patch is going to be much more well received than some of the previous ones. So A+ in my book, but there are a couple areas in this patch preview, I should say, that are of more interest to me. First and foremost, we'll go over some of the changes with Engineer. Now, I'm not much of an Engineer player, so I'm not going to be talking too critically about this. However, I do want to touch base on some Scrapper changes, as that seems to be kind of a hot button issue. Now, you might be watching this and saying, KROOF, you're not an Engineer main nor much of an Engineer player, you have no say in this. However, to play more towards what the developers and the balance team are saying and what their philosophy seems to be with certain utility designs. Enough running around the actual topic, this is about the wells, the gyros. They used to be gyros, now they're wells. And we are seeing a change in how the wells actually function. As wells are in game right now, they are typically 900 ranged ground target areas where you create an area of effect. You heal, you damage, you boon corrupt, you apply boons, a multitude of ways to interact with that area. With the Scrapper though, it was always centered around your character when they were transformed into wells. And with the Scrapper's access to quickness and also super speed and mobility as well as stability, they were very strong and powerful moving forces, moving effects that were extremely flexible in almost any given situation. So long as you were able to get to a certain area with your allies or enemies, you had effect. But that's not usually how wells work. So what they've decided to do is make it more uniform with the actual category of utilities. These gyros are now going to be placed at 900 range and their effects will play out in that area. I, for one, think that the purity of purpose and the consistency with the actual utility category is perhaps more important than just the Scrappers having their overpowered fun with the wells. So personally, despite not being a Scrapper player, I actually do appreciate this change in terms of keeping the philosophy and design within the utility types consistent. However, they also mentioned within the live stream that the rules around philosophy and around balancing the game can sometimes be broken when it is deemed necessary. They've talked about how certain crowd control abilities are going to be getting more damage in competitive modes. And I've seen some people on the forums say, well, this is the perfect opportunity to break that mold and allow wells to be centered around your character and always mobile. Now, for those people who are saying that, I would more staunchly disagree. When they were talking about breaking the mold, it wasn't, at least I didn't get the impression, that it was to break the mold of an entire utility category, but instead that breaking of the mold was in reference to certain abilities when it makes sense. Now, I did see some notes, and I also believe from the community and their reaction, that when it comes to the elite well, the stealth gyro, I believe that the stealth gyro is more so deserving of breaking that mold and thus allowing the stealth gyro to still travel with the Scrapper. If it isn't like that, then it's just going to feel very similar to certain thief stealth utility skills. So as a whole, I don't think that I wouldn't like to see every single well break that mold, but when it comes to a very particular well, the stealth gyro, I actually do agree that it might not be most fun or valued if it maintains the system of how wells actually are. So that would be my one exception. And I want to just emphasize to the community and to you, dear viewer, when we are talking about breaking the mold, to also have a sense of conservativeness with that and not go to the nth degree of breaking the mold for an entire category of skills or an entire category of how skills work and function. So overall, I respect their direction, but I would like to toy around with the idea of letting the elite skill feel more elite and feel more differentiated and more impactful than the other skills. But overall, I actually am really interested to see how this will affect scrappers. Next, I want to touch on Guardian, and mostly touch again once on things that we don't see. Now, with the competitive change in World vs. World, they have gone through with the nerf to Mantra of Liberation. They held off, they were testing it out a little bit more, letting people have discussions, and it seems that they want to test it out in-game. However, we haven't seen any changes to Willbender or even Firebrand, and of course this is a bit more of a competitive-minded balance patch, so Firebrands aren't necessarily dominating in things like structured PvP. Perhaps they are in World vs. World. I'm not much of a World vs. World player. But when it comes to Willbender, I've heard that Willbenders are really pulling a lot of damage, a lot of burning damage, which to me is a little unfortunate, as I would hope that would be the place of the Firebrand and that the Willbender kind of played around more with strike damage. But from what I've heard is that Willbender is still a little bit more of a threat, and that not seeing it have any changes in this balance patch, it's a little concerning, it's a little bewildering. And to be honest, I felt bewildered for quite some time when looking at Guardian changes. We either get like 1 or 2 changes, or we just get like certain buffs or nerfs that don't really impact the state of the class, but just impact one specific skill, but overall keeps them in that cherished golden child position. So, as a Guardian player, it's not that I want them to nerf it to the ground, but when I see so many other professions getting larger reworks to certain abilities and traits, and see them get a list of changes, it is a little saddening that Guardian doesn't ever feel like it's getting a lot of attention in terms of reworks. I think Guardian is maybe one of the professions that has escaped any larger reworks, and there are elements to the class which could be updated or changed, particularly with Firebrand, so I am still hopeful that maybe next balance patch during November, we will see maybe larger changes to Firebrand and actual redesigns, not just nerfs, because I don't want it to just be totally useless. I much more value redesigns where it's still effective, but tackles issues that are not of just numerical value and numerical issues, but of actual gameplay issues. Now let's move over to the Ranger, because the Ranger is another profession that I really want to talk about more so at length. And I feel a little bit more comfortable talking about this rather than the Engineer and the Scrapper. So for the Druid, specifically, we're really going to be talking about Druid. They've changed quite a few elements of the Druid, and I'm 95% of it, I'm extremely happy. Super, super excited to get to actually test this out in game. But there are certain elements to these updates that leave me a little concerned, specifically allied targeting skills. So first up on this balance patch note, is Astral Wisp, your staff's second ability. This skill now targets allies. After attaching to a target, the skill will now pulse healing to allies around the target instead of creating a circling projectile that heals allies. So first and foremost, I was super happy and pleased to see that many of our speculations were correct and that it is going to be an ally targeting skill. They didn't hover over the tooltip when they were doing the live stream, and I really wish they did, because I need to be more informed to see that they are taking ally targeting skills seriously and are giving them the proper attention that they require. If we look back at the most recent change with Staff Druid, it's auto attack. If you have an ally targeted, it's not actually healing them for any more, in the same way that you would expect on something like a Spectre, where if you are taking the time to target an ally and they maybe need more healing and they're in trouble, and you take the conscious effort to target them in order to heal them up, you really want to feel as if you are being impactful and that your decision-making is impacting your allies' survivability. But as we saw with the auto attack for Staff, it really is weak. It's extremely lackluster. I still get more use out of it by targeting an enemy and making sure that I'm keeping that damage up. Even as a healer, you're still trying to maximize as much DPS as you can, at least the good healers out there. But it's still important to keep up DPS, and when you're not getting that, and instead you're just pinging an ally for 100 healing over time in a very slow channel, it feels like you're wasting your potential. So what I would have appreciated is to see a patch note saying that, hey, when you have an ally targeted and you're using your auto attack, that specific target is being healed more, and then any allies in the path are just receiving its normal or reduced healing. And in the same vein of Astral Wisp, I am partially worried that they didn't actually give time and care to this ally targeting ability and instead just slapped the mechanic on. To the point where if you are taking the time to target an ally to hopefully heal them up, it's not actually going to do a greater packet of healing once the orb reaches them. It instead will just circle that passive healing to that ally and anyone around that particular ally. Which is useful, but in addition with this change of increasing the radius, you would get technically more use out of this ability if you strike an enemy, because you're getting that damage and the healing is being triggered in a larger area, making it easier to get effect out of this ability anyways. So I really hope that they didn't just give it a single target feature and call it a day. I would love to see updates to the auto attack on Solar Beam. I really hope that they've taken the time and consideration with Astral Wisp. And I'm also disappointed that Celestial Avatar auto attack does not have a single target or ally target feature. The ability is just extremely hard to hit. It's like a 120 radius, it has a cast time, the effect has to come down, and allies in Guild Wars 2 are always on the move. So by the time that skill actually lands, the person you wanted to heal is miles away. They outran a centaur. There are other ally targeting abilities that I think should come into the game, namely on Staff Elementalist, Staff Guardian, even Staff Mesmer, certain magical elements of utility skills, but that might be even further in the future for like a more general patch that isn't just competitively minded. So I really wanted to talk about Astral Wisp. I might have even popped up on screen like an idea that I have around how these abilities might function, because as it is right now, if you're not getting an empowered version of your ability on your ally target, it feels like you're wasting your time. Now let's move over and talk about the glyphs. All in all, they were just received some buffs and cooldown reductions because certain traits that we'll get to have been removed. But I want to talk about Glyph of Stars. So for Glyph of Stars, it's no longer a channeled ability. It's just something that you place at a location and the effect plays out. It now also pulses stability, which is very useful. But I gotta say, for a healing and for a more, just to use the terminology of support, even though it's extremely vague in Guild Wars 2, for a healer, stability is nice, but there are also other specializations which I feel fit it more so. Probably like Spellbreaker, Untamed, Scrapper, and other more tanky / bruisery elite specializations. With range, you're getting access to Alacrity. Instead of stability, I would have actually appreciated Glyph of Stars to be pulsing Alacrity so that you don't have to take your elite nature spirit. Or have another glyph also apply Alacrity. There's still something missing with the way that Ranger grants Alacrity to its allies. And I think it's really a missed opportunity to put more of that onto Druid. But once again, maybe we'll see that in the November patch. But all in all, the way that Glyph of Stars has been changed currently, I am a huge fan of this, and I think it will give you even more decisions to make in terms of which elite skill you're going to bring into combat. And then finally, for Celestial Avatar, its second ability, Seed of Life, they've increased the radius to 240, and it's more so of an instant ability that doesn't have as long of a detonation. I wouldn't mind to see its cooldown be increased to perhaps like 5 or 6 seconds, just so that you have a little bit more time and a little bit more decision making with this ability, especially with it being easier to hit now. I don't know if it needs its short cooldown, but the buffs that they are giving it, big fan. I always like to think about like certain nerfs every once in a while. Now let's discuss some trait changes with Druid. So first and foremost, Celestial Being no longer reduces your pet attributes by 20%. Big wins. Natural Mender, which is your another minor trait. This no longer has a stacking effect. It instead just boosts your healing power to others. Baseline. You don't have to worry about getting heals off. And additionally, this trait now grants Astral Force every second while not in Celestial Avatar. This means that the functionality, which was on the Grandmaster Lingering Light, has been baked into the core Druid design. And I called this when they introduced that trait. I said, this would feel so amazing if Druid had baseline access to this. It was such a great feature that I didn't choose any of the other Grandmasters. And I was like, I'm just going for that because it's the easiest way and more accessible way to get into Celestial Avatar. And you don't have to worry about, oh, I have no one to heal, so I'm not getting the most out of it. Oh, but there's no one really to damage. And, the damaging itself doesn't generate as much CA. So, huge change. Absolutely love it. Verdant Etching. I want to talk about this. This used to summon a Seed of Life, a Celestial Avatar ability, to do extra healing and also reduce the cooldown of your glyphs. Now glyphs are just reduced cooldown in general. But what this does now is that you will now grant protection to nearby allies after using a glyph skill instead of its previous effect. Now, protection is very useful. It's pretty powerful. It's pretty potent. You reduce everyone's strike damage by 33%. It is of a high value trait to take. However, this also negatively impacts Grace of the Land, I should say. Grace of the Land, your Grandmaster trait for Druid, is your might stacking trait and was oftentimes used in raiding and in group content in PvE. Now that they've also taken away access to Seed of Life when you're not in Celestial Avatar form, it's going to feel a little bit worse in terms of your overall might generation. However, you're also getting access to Celestial Avatar more frequently, but you still have a 20-second cooldown on it. So all in all, the Grandmaster trait of Grace of the Land has in a way taken another hit, but also been slightly compensated. I ultimately don't know how to feel about it. And all in all, Grace of the Land doesn't feel that impactful anymore, should I say. And the idea of putting might on it, I don't know if it's necessarily as fitting. What I would like to see instead is to play around with that alacrity idea, is for Grace of the Land to grant your allies momentary alacrity when they're affected by Celestial Avatar skills. Something like 2 or 3 seconds, where you get more benefit out of it by being in Celestial Avatar and having more of a focus on that, so you can generate alacrity more quickly. You can also add a little bit more to that trait to further incentivize, if they already have maximum stacks of alacrity, they're also maybe healed or something, or, you gain healing power if you have alacrity, etc., etc. But Grace of the Land is in a very weird position, especially now that Verdant Etching has been changed the way it has. Next, I want to just touch on Soulbeast because it's just so cool. Elevated Bond, this no longer prevents pet swapping, so you'll be able to pet swap in combat. And Leader of the Pack, which is your Grandmaster trait to share your stances. That's been increased to 600 radius, so you don't have to be super close to people. You can get easier access to that. Love that. And then Eternal Bond. This was the cherry on top. This was such a cool change and was so ballsy that this is the stuff I want to see, really interesting changes. Now, of course, I don't want to see a whole wall of it, but for each profession to have some very interesting trait changes that can really pivot the way that you approach your profession and your elite spec. So this change now grants healing when you are merged with your pet using their F1 through F3 skills. This also gives you an F4 ability to change your pets and swap your pets while you are merged. So you no longer need to become unmerged, swap your pet, wait for that cooldown, and then merge again. You can now do it while you are in beast mode. And swapping your pets does not carry the cooldown. So if you use all 3 of your beast abilities and swap your pet, other pets' cooldowns are completely unaffected. So you could spam 6 beast abilities all at once. 6 of your pet's abilities in very quick succession, back to back to back to back to back. It's gonna be a little scary, and I wouldn't be surprised if they kind of did a 3 to 5 second cooldown if you swap your pets while merged, where whatever pet you're swapping into, it doesn't matter their cooldowns. There is at least a 3, 4, 5 second cooldown before you can utilize those abilities, just because it could be a little sketchy. And maybe even having a visual effect to showcase that a Soulbeast has swapped pets while they're merged, just to let the enemy players in the team have a bit more of a visual cue. That could also be useful. One of the bigger classes that I want to touch on is Warrior. Once again, I'm not someone who plays a whole lot of Warrior, but I was extremely excited to see that Warrior was given so much love. This was really the Warrior patch, or at least it gives off the impression that it's the Warrior and Ranger patch, which is really cool. I want to talk a little bit about the core traits first. First and foremost, almost all of the traits in defense have been changed to some degree. Thick Skin, your very first minor, now grants you protection upon using a healing skill. Adrenal Health will scale more effectively with elite specializations that only utilize 1 bar of adrenaline, so that you're not just always weaker with those traits, and that carries on to other traits that, scale based off of how many bars of adrenaline you use. There was a change to Shield Master, Cool the Weak. Defy Pain, which is one of these 300-second cooldown traits in competitive modes. This now will trigger upon you using an elite skill. And so you have a little bit more control over when you get these more so powerful defensive and retaliatory effects with these traits. And I actually really appreciate that. I think it's going to be a little scary with Berserker. You should probably add a cooldown to that. I'd say the cooldown of Defy Pain would comfortably sit at around 30 seconds or so, just because it is so incredibly strong. It's just so strong. Next, Armored Attack was changed to Resilient Roll. Gain resistance at the end of your dodge roll. I actually appreciate this a lot. I think it'll allow warriors to get into melee combat a bit more effectively and more consistently. So big change with that. Merciless Hammer was put back into the defense line, which just gives you more damage on disabled foes and reduce the adrenaline gain from 10 to 7, and the trait no longer reduces the cooldown of hammer skills. For your Grandmasters, Last Stand, this is your stance Grandmaster. This trait no longer grants lesser balanced stance when disabled. This trait now applies Barrier in addition to Vigor when using a stance skill, so it's much more applicable to all of your stances. And I personally love this. More uptime and more access to Barrier as a defensive mechanic, rather than just like Aegis or something like that. So that also kind of dovetailed to Guardian, but I'm a huge fan of this change with Last Stand. And even in PvE situations, you'll get more use out of it if you want to be a bit more defensive and survive a bit more. Cleansing Ire, this trait now removes 1 condition plus an additional condition per bar of adrenaline spent. Rousing Resilience has been updated to Stalwart Strength. Disabling an enemy grants stability. While you have stability, your strike damage is increased. This is really playing into the idea of a tank specialization that I would love to see more on other elite specs, specifically like Spellbreaker, but we'll get to Spellbreaker here in a bit. I like this a lot. It feels somewhat reminiscent to certain Dragon Hunter traits, but all in all, I really like it. There were also plenty of updates to Berserker. Most notably, your F1 is coming back in competitive modes. At least it might also affect PvE, I'm not too sure. One element of the 300-second cooldown traits that's being removed is the Berserker trait, Dead or Alive. Absolutely love this one so much. This trait has been reworked. It now grants 2 seconds of Blood Reckoning when entering Berserk mode. This is your heal where you heal based off of the damage that you deal for a percentage. So you're going to be getting a lot more active survivability rather than waiting for you to drop down low or having to save your profession mechanics when you're almost dead. Next, Spellbreaker. Now, I'm actually really enjoying Spellbreaker. Spellbreaker might be one of my more favorite warrior elite specializations, simply because you can have so much fun with it. But I don't feel like they're having fun with Spellbreaker. There's an element to these changes that I feel like is missing. First and foremost, Featherfoot Grace. The cooldown has been reduced from 35 seconds to 30 seconds. Featherfoot Grace is one of your weaker utility skills, and in all honesty, I think Spellbreaker has probably the weakest showcase of utility skills in the game. Featherfoot Grace will break your stun, give you super speed, and give you resistance. I think there could be a group element to this with a Spellbreaker. Spellbreakers being more tanky, a bit more bruisery, a bit more masters of controlling effects. So for Featherfoot Grace, I would actually like to see this be a group stun break if you utilize Featherfoot Grace, giving yourself that quickness and resistance while breaking stuns on allies, and perhaps even granting allies around you resistance. Maybe not super speed, but I think resistance sharing could be really interesting. But there's something just missing with some of these changes. In addition to the other utility skills that weren't updated, your imminent threat, that taunt, is so weak. The adrenaline gain feels really weak, and that resolution is also extremely weak. Understand that in competitive modes, taunt is extremely scary, and you don't want to have a lot of it. And that's why I'm just like, get rid of taunt in competitive modes. Just fully scrap taunt and leave it to PvE. And instead of something where you have a second of a taunt that feels more or less, you know, kind of useless in the grand scheme of things, if imminent threat was instead you slow all your enemies around you for 4 seconds while you gain barrier and adrenaline for each foe hit. Instead of something as weak as resolution, I mean, I say as weak as resolution, but all in all, a bit more of an active defensive generating barrier might be more useful for Spellbreakers. Breaching Strike, we have a couple more updates to like full counter, Breaching Strike, Aura Slice, or Disturbing Stab. A couple trait changes, Revenge Counter. This has its resistance duration increased from 2 to 4 seconds. And this is another time where I'm like, it could have, instead of just increasing the duration, if it also was shared out to allies, not just in PvP and World versus World only, but as a general change, so that Spellbreakers can have a bit more group utility and group defense focus. Also, other traits that haven't been updated is like Guard Counter. That trait is so incredibly weak, in my opinion. You gain protection when you use a successful full counter. I'd much rather see that trait grant you barrier if you have a successful full counter, and then you share out protection around you. Really honing into the idea of a Spellbreaker that is a bruiser and a master of defenses, rather than just, oh, I'm a Spellbreaker that gives out a bunch of healing and a bunch of super speed and quickness and whatnot. Some of these more common playstyles that we see kind of mixed into other specs. But yeah, all in all, Spellbreaker felt a little like a missed opportunity to kind of do something more fun and play around with the idea of magic stripping and more of a bruiser, more of a genuine tank in combat. Not that it's taunting enemies in competitive modes, but rather you're kind of a master of the controlling effects of battle. You know, access to group stun breaks, even group stability. You're destroying boons on enemies, and you're allowing your teammates to have a bit of a better time, while of course having access to damage so that you can defend yourself and, you know, secure kills. All in all, everyone, I think those are the elements that I really wanted to hit for this specific preview and kind of give my feedback. Of course, Revenant has 2 dodges again, which is going for Vindicator, I should say. So that's going to be really strange and interesting to try out. Elementalist, we got some updates, but nothing too wild. There was a change to the way that Torment works in competitive modes to get a bit more use out of it, etc., etc. So everyone, I would love to hear your comments down below about all of these changes, even changes that we didn't get to. Once again, I'm not huge on the engineer, but I'll try to interact as much as possible on that front. Thank you all so very much for coming on by. Like the video if you liked it. Comment down below your reactions, of course. Subscribe for more videos, and if you'd like to help support the Patreon and get early access to these videos, head on over there. Truly appreciate you patrons. You're doing great. I also stream on Twitch every day of the week, so come catch me there playing some Guild Wars too. Thank you all so very much, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Bye everyone! Mwah.